The Mongols had already changed the map of the world.
Charge and break them!
From the steppes of Central Asia, their armies had crossed mountains, deserts, and kingdoms. But one Mongol prince was about to carry their conquest into the heart of the Middle East. His name was Hulagu Khan. He was not Genghis Khan. He was Genghis Khan's grandson. And unlike his grandfather, Hulagu's greatest chapter would unfold far from the Mongolian steppe. It would unfold in Persia, Iraq, and the lands surrounding Baghdad. Welcome to History Uncovered. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had become one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But the empire was no longer controlled by a single ruler in the way it had been under Genghis Khan. Different branches of the royal family controlled different regions. Hulagu belonged to the Talyuid branch of the Mongol royal family. His father was Talyui, one of Genghis Khan's sons. His brother was Murnkh Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. And when Murnkh decided that the Mongols needed to expand deeper into the Middle East, Hulagu was given a massive army and an enormous mission. His objective was clear: bring the remaining independent powers of the region under Mongol control. Hulagu's campaign began in the 1250s. He moved west with a huge force of Mongol warriors and allied troops. But his first major targets were not Baghdad. They were the strongholds of the Nizari Ismailis, commonly known in the West as the Assassins. For years, these mountain fortresses had resisted powerful rulers. Their most famous stronghold was Alamut, hidden among the mountains of northern Persia. Hulagu's army advanced toward these fortresses. The Mongols surrounded them. One by one, the strongholds began to fall. Eventually, the famous fortress of Alamut surrendered. The Mongol campaign had achieved an important victory. But Hulagu's greatest target was still ahead: Baghdad. For centuries, Baghdad had been one of the most important cities in the Islamic world. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It had once been a center of science, philosophy, literature, medicine, mathematics, and scholarship. The memory of the legendary House of Wisdom still represented Baghdad's extraordinary intellectual history. But by Hulagu's arrival, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer the powerful empire it had once been. Its political influence had weakened. Its territory had shrunk. And its ruler, Caliph al-Mustasim, still sat in Baghdad. The Mongols wanted submission. The Caliph did not immediately give it. Hulagu continued toward Iraq. His army approached Baghdad in early 1258. The city was surrounded by walls. Inside were soldiers, civilians, scholars, merchants, and families. Outside stood one of the most experienced military forces of the age. The Mongols began preparing the siege. They built siege positions. They surrounded the city. And they used powerful weapons to attack Baghdad's defenses. The city's defenders fought back. But they were facing an enemy that had already conquered enormous territories across Asia. The Mongol army was disciplined. Its commanders had decades of battlefield experience. And Hulagu had no intention of simply waiting outside the walls. The siege tightened. Day after day, the pressure increased. Eventually, parts of Baghdad's defenses were breached. The situation inside the city became desperate. The Caliph's forces could no longer hold the Mongol army back. Then, after roughly 2 weeks of siege, Baghdad's fate was sealed. In February 1258, the city surrendered. The Abbasid Caliphate had reached its dramatic end in Baghdad. But surrender did not mean that the story was over. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in the history of the city. Mongol troops entered Baghdad. The city was devastated. Buildings were destroyed. People were killed. Libraries and collections of manuscripts suffered enormous losses. The exact scale of destruction and deaths has been debated by historians, and many later accounts greatly exaggerated the numbers. But there is no doubt that Baghdad suffered a catastrophic blow. For centuries, the city had symbolized the intellectual and political power of the Abbasid world. Now its political center had fallen, and at the center of this transformation stood Hulagu Khan. The Mongol prince had accomplished what few rulers before him had been able to do. He had brought Baghdad under Mongol control. But his campaign was not finished. Beyond Iraq lay Syria, and there another major power was waiting. The Mongols would soon face the Mamluks, and the outcome of that confrontation would prove that even the Mongols could be stopped. But before that battle, Hulagu had to decide how far his conquest would continue. His army had reached the heart of the Middle East. His enemies were watching, and the next chapter would determine whether the Mongols would conquer Syria, or finally meet a force capable of stopping them. Baghdad had fallen. The Abbasid Caliphate had been broken, and Hulagu Khan now stood at the center of a Mongol campaign that had shaken the Middle East. But Hulagu wanted more. His next target was Syria. If Syria fell, the road toward Egypt would open. And beyond Egypt stood the Mamluk Sultanate, one of the most powerful military states in the region. The Mongols were moving toward another confrontation. But events far to the east were about to change everything. In 1259, Hulagu had been preparing for further campaigns when news arrived that would transform the situation. His brother Mongol Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, had died. The death of the great Khan created a struggle for succession. Hulagu could no longer continue his campaign with his entire army. He withdrew a large portion of his forces from Syria and moved back toward Persia. But he left a Mongol army behind under his commander, Kitbuka Noyan. The Mongols continued advancing. They captured important cities, and in 1260 they entered the region of Syria. The city of Damascus fell to the Mongols and their allies. For a moment, it appeared that the Mongol advance might continue southward. But one power refused to surrender: the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks were not simply rulers sitting behind palace walls. They were a military elite. Many had been trained as professional soldiers. They understood Mongol warfare, and they knew that if the Mongols reached Egypt, their own state could be threatened with destruction. The Mamluk Sultan Qutuz prepared for war. His most famous commander was Baybars. The two men faced an enormous challenge. The Mongols had already defeated armies across Asia. They had destroyed powerful states. They had taken Baghdad. Now they were coming toward Egypt. The Mamluks decided to meet them. In September 1260, the two armies confronted each other near Ain Jalut in Palestine. The battle would become one of the most important encounters of the medieval world. The Mongols had been used to overwhelming their enemies with mobility, discipline, and devastating cavalry tactics. But the Mamluks understood those tactics. They used the terrain. They used mounted archers. And they carefully planned their attack. Baybars commanded the advance. He engaged the Mongol forces and then withdrew, drawing them forward. The Mongols pursued. But the Mamluks had prepared an ambush. The Mongol army was suddenly attacked from multiple directions. The battle became fierce. Kitbuka continued fighting, but the Mongol force was heavily pressured. Eventually, the Mamluks defeated the Mongol army. Kitbuka was captured and executed. For the first time, the Mongol advance into the Middle East had suffered a major defeat. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been damaged. But Hulagu was not finished. He returned to Persia and established his power there. The territories under his control became known as the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate would become one of the major Mongol successor states. Its rulers controlled large parts of Persia and surrounding territories for generations. But Hulagu's world was changing. The Mongols were no longer simply an army moving from one conquest to another. They were becoming rulers of settled civilizations. And ruling those lands required something different from conquering them. Hulagu's descendants gradually adopted elements of the cultures they ruled. They interacted with Persian administrators, scholars, and artists. The Mongol rulers of Persia eventually became deeply connected to the Islamic and Persian world around them. But Hulagu himself did not live long enough to see the full transformation. He died in 1265. He was buried on an island in Lake Urmia, according to historical accounts. He left behind a complicated legacy. To some, Hulagu represented the devastating power of the Mongol conquest. His campaign destroyed cities, ended dynasties, and caused enormous human suffering. To others, his rule marked the beginning of a new political era in Persia. The Ilkhanate that followed would eventually become a major center of Persian culture and administration. But one event would remain permanently connected to Hulagu's name: the fall of Baghdad. For centuries, Baghdad had been one of the great centers of civilization. Its scholars had contributed to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, literature, and science. The city had survived wars and political struggles before. But the events of 1258 marked a profound turning point. The Abbasid political order in Baghdad was gone. The Mongols had demonstrated that even one of the most famous cities of the medieval world could fall. Yet the story of the Mongols in the Middle East was not simply a story of destruction. It was also a story of transformation. The Mongols connected distant regions through trade. They moved people, technologies, ideas, and cultures across enormous distances. And their descendants eventually became part of the civilizations they had conquered. This was one of the great paradoxes of the Mongol Empire. The conquerors changed the world. But the world also changed the conquerors. Hulagu Khan's story is therefore more complicated than the image of a ruthless Mongol warrior. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan, a commander, a conqueror, a founder of the Ilkhanate, and one of the most important figures in the history of medieval Persia and the Middle East. His campaign changed Baghdad forever. But his defeat at Ain Jalut also showed something equally important. The Mongol Empire had limits. They could cross mountains. They could defeat enormous armies. They could conquer legendary cities. But they could not conquer everything. Eventually, the Mongols had to negotiate, adapt, settle, and rule. And in the lands of the Middle East, their greatest legacy was not simply what they destroyed. It was the new world that emerged after the conquest. More than 7 centuries later, the name Hulagu Khan still carries the weight of that era. An era of horses and arrows, of empires and sieges, of destruction and transformation, and of a Mongol prince who marched west and changed the history of the Middle East forever. This was the story of Hulagu Khan. Thank you for watching History Uncovered. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most powerful and controversial figures, subscribe for more stories hidden beneath the surface of the past.